is CNN Breaking News.
Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Aisha Sasay in Los Angeles. Let's get right to the breaking news. It's 117 days into the Donald Trump presidency, and explosive controversies are starting to emerge daily. The latest bombshell, a memo by the former FBI director detailing a meeting with the president on the investigation of the fired national security advisor. Jim Acosta has the details.
The White House is pushing back on a memo written by former FBI Director James Comey that accuses President Trump of interfering with the investigation of ex-National Security Advisor Michael Flynn. White House officials released a statement saying the president did not ask Comey to end his probe into Flynn's contacts with Russian officials. Sources inside the White House sounded anxious about the Comey news. One gloomy-sounding official did not even try to spin the controversy, telling me, quote, "I just don't know what to say on this one." But other sources close to the White House sounded defiant, with one source saying all of the outrage may help with the president's base of supporters. Still, Republican worries are starting to mount over the controversy, with a spokeswoman for House Speaker Paul Ryan saying in a statement that Comey's memo should be turned over to Congress. Jim Acosta, CNN, Washington.
Well, join me now, CNN law enforcement contributor Steve Moore, civil rights attorney Brian Claypool, Democratic strategist Caroline Heldman, and Republican strategist Austin James. Welcome to you all. It's going to be a very busy night, so let's get going. Austin, to start with you, I want you to take a listen to David Gergen, a CNN political commentator, also a former advisor to a number of presidents. Take a listen to what he had to say about this Comey memo.
I was in the Nixon administration, as you know, and I thought after watching the Clinton impeachment, I thought I'd never see another one. But I think we're in impeachment territory now for the first time. Well, I think that the obstruction of justice was the #1 charge against Nixon that brought him down. Obstruction of justice was the #1 charge against Bill Clinton, which led to his indictment in the House. He won in the Senate. And I think I'm a lapsed lawyer. I cannot tell you what it meets all the legal definitions, but I can tell you from a lay point of view, it looks like he was trying to impede the investigation.
Austin, how much trouble is the president in here?
Well, listen, I may be the one on the panel here who doesn't think it's that big of a deal for a couple of reasons. One, I mean, you have a Republican Congress that's not going to move to take any serious action on this, especially without seeing where the tides are going to fall come election season. I think the bigger issue is with the Comey himself. You know, he's kind of put himself into a box on this. And so legally, if he thought there was an obstruction of justice, he had to report that to the Department of Justice, in which he didn't do. And so just by default, he's saying that it was uncomfortable for him, perhaps, but there was no wrongdoing. And if you listen to what was alleged in the memo, it sounds like something we would expect from a man who wrote The Art of the Deal, nothing more.
All right. Caroline, do you see it the same way? I mean, in response to this question of him not going to the DOJ, the sources close to him say it's because he didn't want to impede the investigation, so he kept it quiet and he didn't feel like he had been influenced. What is your read of the situation, Caroline? Are we in impeachment territory, as David Gergen said?
We're certainly in impeachment territory. I very much disagree with Austin, and I understand that he needs to kind of parse what happened in that meeting, but it is the confirmation of our worst fears from last week, which is that the president is comfortable going in and meddling with the person who is in charge of the investigation, whether it is asking him to stop investigating Michael Flynn or firing him because perhaps he was getting too close to the truth. At the end of the day, this looks really, really bad for the White House. I feel for the White House staff who have been through the ringer the last couple of weeks, self-inflicted wounds. When it comes to impeachment, it's not a legal criminal standard we're looking at. The Constitution specifies that it's high crimes and misdemeanors. We've only had 2 impeachments in U.S. history. No,
let it finish.
And it's been done for partisan reasons. So I agree with you that the Republicans probably won't take action because high crimes and misdemeanors is really a political thing. But at the end of the day, they should take action because the American public can see through this. The optics here are awful.
Austin, very quickly, because I want to bring in Brian.
Caroline, you just said that it didn't meet the standard of impeachment, so why are we throwing those words around?
Criminal impeachment, I'm talking about congressional. They have a different standard.
All right, as you're both let me bring in the legal mind here. Let me, Brian Claypool, I want you to weigh in on what you're hearing here in terms of the standards, what this meets on the face of it. Again, this is just, the White House is pushing back on this, but this is what we're hearing is in this memo. Does it meet the standard for impeachment? Where are we in terms of criminal proceedings? Break it down for us.
Aisha, not even close to obstruction of justice and not even close to an impeachment proceeding. The comment by President Trump, let it go, he's a good guy, that in and of itself, Aisha, is not enough. You need some additional information. You need evidence of, for example, intimidation, a destruction of records. For example, there are any records that might have implicated President Trump and he destroyed those records. That might lead to obstruction of justice. Intimidation of witnesses is another example of where you have obstruction of justice. We don't have any of that collateral evidence or information that would support obstruction of justice.
All right. I hear what you're saying, and I don't want to cut you off, but I do want you to listen to CNN senior legal analyst Jeffrey Toobin. I want you to listen to what he had to say before you continue, because he has a different take on this issue of obstruction of justice. Take a listen.
3 words: obstruction of justice. Telling the FBI director to close down an investigation of your senior campaign advisor for his activities during your campaign for president, if that's true, that is obstruction of justice. Why do you think Director Comey wrote a memo to the file about it? Because he was so appalled that a president of the United States would behave in this way.
Brian, why is Jeffrey wrong?
I'll tell you why he's wrong. Because if James Comey really thought that this was obstruction of justice, the moment that President Trump told him that and said, let it go, he's a good guy, then why didn't James Comey immediately then go to the Department of Justice and report that? His credibility is diminished by virtue of having waited to have it come forward at this point. So that's why I think Jeff Toobin is wrong.
All right, let me bring in Steve Moore. He's our former FBI guy here. You hear what Brian says, that Comey's credibility is damaged by the fact he did not go to the DOJ, and it undercuts the significance or the impact of this memo. You say what?
I think that's an indication of not understanding how the FBI works, and I disagree with Brian and Austin in this. I've heard this all day, that Comey didn't say anything. Well, the FBI is not like the police. I mean, when Donald Trump said something that Comey obviously felt was criminal in nature or potentially criminal in nature, he doesn't pull out a gun and say you're under arrest. The FBI looks at things, they calculate things. He went back to the office, he got his lawyers around, and he said, what are we going to do? Do I call the Justice Department? You mean the one that works for the guy who you're about to say committed a crime that might result in impeachment? No, you sit there, and the FBI does this as a matter of policy and course. You make your case, then you go public. And so people saying that he's not going to not going to notify a person who reports directly to the suspect, it makes no sense that he would even do that. So that, to me, is not even a persuasive argument. So I'm not saying that I think that that Trump committed a crime, but I'm saying that the fact that Comey didn't immediately report it to somebody who worked for Trump means nothing.
Okay, Brian, I've got to give you a chance to respond to that, because to that, let me also add the fact that we are hearing that James Comey did tell a number of people about the conversation. So he may not have gone to the DOJ, but he didn't exactly keep it to himself. Give your legal response.
Aisha, a human response to a comment is very revealing. And I can tell you that if James Comey truly believed that that comment by President Trump to let it go, Flynn is a good guy, if Comey really, truly believed on a visceral level that that comment was meant to interfere with the investigation, to stop Comey from getting potential evidence in the Russian investigation, then I guarantee you that Comey's been out there in the public before. He would have reported this to Congress and the Department of Justice, and something would have been done at that point. That's my view, and I stand by that.
Okay, Austin, to come back to you here. According to the New York Times reporting on this matter and how this played out, the president asked the vice president and the attorney general to leave the room before he launched into this conversation with Comey. I mean, how does that look to you?
Sure. I mean, listen, like I said before, I think this is something that you would probably expect from a businessman with no political experience. I think it was a misstep. Surely it was bad optics. But we don't know if any of this is true. I mean, let's be very clear here. These are all things that we're hearing through secondhand sources. And I think, you know, one of the things when I was in Washington that we were very wary of was don't pick a fight with someone who buys ink by the gallon. And I think, you know, I think what's happening here is the Trump administration marginalized the media. They made the intelligence agencies in the community kind of draw a line.
So
in
you're
the
saying
sand.
this is payback?
Well, listen, I think there's aspects of it for sure, and so that's why I'm very, you know, I'm very cognizant of how we're parsing our words. You know, so to claim impeachment, I think just feeds the narrative, and the narrative feeds the headlines, and we have no real facts here, so we should be very careful.
Okay, let me also just make the point that our own Jake Tapper did speak to a source that did corroborate the content of the memo. Of course,
Sure.
the accuracy of them is another matter, but the contents that this memo exists, and it was written and detailing this conversation as reported by the New York Times. CNN has been able to also go ahead and confirm. Caroline, let's get back to this issue of if only the optics, according to the New York Times, of asking the vice president and asking the attorney general to leave, it's going to raise a question. Did the president know he was straying into territory that was perhaps troubling or troublesome down the line?
Why else would you have those people leave the room, given the fact that you had been sitting in the room with them having a conversation? And at this point in time, Jeff Sessions and Mike Pence can confirm whether or not that took place, whether or not they were asked to leave. And I will just add that I think it's interesting that folks from the right on the panel tonight are really focusing on Comey. They're focusing on the whistleblower. And I think that's the strategy that you use when your man is in trouble. And there's no doubt he's in trouble. I also think it's interesting that we're going to the criminal standard of impeachment. That's not the standard at play. The House of Representatives can impeach someone over a sex scandal, as we found out in the 90s. So they get to decide what high crimes and misdemeanors are, and it's telling that congressional Republicans are looking into those details tonight. Who knows if they'll go down that path? I think party politics will probably play out, but perhaps it will get us a special prosecutor so that we have some independence in investigating Russia, since it is clear from a series of missteps, self-inflicted wounds, that the Russia investigation is not independent from the White House at this point.
Yeah. Brian, to come back to you, as we try and, you know, get a grasp, at least certainly us lay people who aren't legal minds, try and get a grasp of the standards here as we talk about obstruction of justice, and certain voices start, you know, talking about the possibility of impeachment or at least entering that territory. I want you to listen to John Dean, who's a former White House counsel to President Nixon. Listen to what he had to say about this development.
There is an obstruction here. Without getting deep into the weeds of technical legal issues, not always is it an obstruction to just interfere with an FBI investigation or to impede it even. It has to be connected with a judicial proceeding, and we don't have all those facts at this point. But there's no question it could be impeachable. Indeed, Nixon was impeached for just such an act.
Brian, are the parallels with Nixon correct here?
Well, Aisha, let me make one point clear. Obstruction of justice usually results from a pending, like he just said, where there's an investigation going on. For example, President Trump is interviewed during an investigation. The context here is completely off. He's having a discussion with James Comey. That's it. And he makes a comment off the cuff because President Trump is used to being in the boardroom, not in the White House. So he makes that comment. It just doesn't rise to the level of obstruction of justice. Impeachment, I agree with your other guest. You don't have to use the criminal standard for that. But even with this comment, I just still don't think it reaches the level of impeachment.
And Steve Moore, it is worth pointing out that this memo does go some way to contradict what the deputy FBI boss, Andrew McCabe, said in his recent testimony on Capitol Hill, because he was asked whether there'd been attempts to impede the FBI investigation. And take a listen to his exchange with Marco Rubio.
Mr. McCabe, can you, without going to the specific of any individual investigation, I think the American people want to know, has the dismissal of Mr. Comey in any way impeded, interrupted, stopped, or negatively impacted any of the work, any investigation, or any ongoing projects at the Federal Bureau of Investigations?
As you know, Senator, the work of the men and women of the FBI continues despite any changes in circumstance, any decisions. So there has been no effort to impede our investigation to date. Quite simply put, sir, you cannot stop the men and women of the FBI from doing the right thing, protecting the American people, and upholding the Constitution.
So, Steve Moore, Andrew McCabe says there's been no effort to impede the efforts of the FBI to date. Again, how much is that undermined, or how much does it undermine this memo that James Comey wrote?
Well, it depends on whether McCabe knew about this memo or not at that time. It's possible that he didn't. The other thing I'd like to address here is that, the thought is that Comey didn't think it was significant. Or he would have done something. Let me tell you that the language of that memo, quoting the president, indicates to me as an investigator that that was memorialized word for word like a prosecutor or an FBI agent would. It's not a little thing. By the way, the president gave me this veiled request to close the investigation. No, he set it up as if he was going to testify to it. And what I want to know is, where is this memo? Is it in a criminal file or is it in an administrative file? And that could decide what's going on. Again, I'm not saying that I know when something's gone to an impeachable level, but and I'm not saying that a crime has occurred, but I don't believe for 1 minute that Comey didn't understand the full gravity of what happened.
Okay, let us put up the White House statement now, because let's get their side of things. The White House being very clear in pushing back against this. Let me read this. It's a brief statement. I'll read it out, all of it. While the president has repeatedly expressed his view that General Flynn is a decent man who served and protected our country, the president has never asked Mr. Comey or anyone else to end any investigation, including any investigation involving General Flynn. The president has the utmost respect for our law enforcement agencies and all investigations. This is not a truthful or accurate portrayal of the conversation between the president and Mr. Comey. The issue here, though, Caroline, to you is, as they say that this is a president that has full respect for law enforcement agencies and all investigations, this is a president who has disparaged the investigations that have been ongoing into issues of Russia and possible collusion with the Trump campaign, calling it a taxpayer charade and a hoax. So, again, that does kind of call into question at least parts of the statement.
Well, I would call the entire statement into question given the last 2 weeks. There appears to be this pattern where you at first deny, and then you have your spokespeople do a semantic dance for a couple of days, and then you come out and admit it, right? We saw this with what happened last week with Comey. We saw this with what happened with Russia yesterday. I wouldn't be surprised if this is not the last word that we hear from the president on this issue, simply because so much of what has been coming from the White House has been to obfuscate. It's been to make sure that the American public is misled about what is happening. I was going to say that it was, a kind of an inadvertent attempt, but it's very clear that what we see is at first a denial, and then a parsing and a dance, and then the president comes out on, an interview with Lester Holt or on Twitter saying, no, I was kidding, I actually did do this. So I wouldn't be surprised if we see a very different message coming from the White House in the next few days, which is a serious issue of credibility that supersedes all all these other issues that we're talking about.
Austin, you can't deny that this is a White House that has credibility issues.
Listen, I will say this. I mean, there's certainly some structural issues with the communications department and how Trump is going to run his White House.
Did you just say structural issues?
Structural with quotes.
Okay.
Structural issues with quotes. And listen, I mean, talking to some of my colleagues back in Washington today, I think there's a lot of disgruntled people walking around the White House. And again, I think this harkens back to the fact that we haven't given a man who's never held political office a grace period. And like I mentioned earlier, he's created a lot of enemies in the public sphere. And so whenever he stumbles up and he kind of gives the wink, wink, nod, nod, Trump style, I think we're going to jump on that, and there isn't a cohesive strategy within the White House on how to respond to that.
Also, he's leader of the free world. You don't give the man who sits in the Oval Office a grace period. He jumps in, and as you know, politically, the sense is you're ready from day one. So I guess some would say, why are you changing the standards and requirements?
Well, listen, so I say grace period on this program, but I would say there's probably many Americans out there who say, okay, listen, this is actually par for the course from what we saw on the campaign trail. Again, going back to let's see the entire memo. Anyone who's worth their salt in D.C., especially a good lawyer, is going to keep copious memos. Okay, and so the fact that there were memos with Trump conversations are not unique. So let's see all of these. Let's put Comey in front of Congress. Let's hear the whole story. And then I think we can have those debates in an honest way.
Okay, there's a lot more to come, a lot more of this conversation. We're going to take a very quick break. More after this. Stay with us.